As Mark mentioned, last week was the Metropolitan Community Church's Northeast Network Gathering. So clergy and lay leaders from churches all across the Northeast gathered together to worship and inspiration, and of course, like any good conference, a drag gospel show. Because, of course. I'm certain that when I sat in my first pew at my first MCC church a number of years ago, I never anticipated that one day I would be sitting in another pew beside the moderator of MCC, holding up our dollar bills for drag queens to come and take them. It may have been far from my mind at the time, the first time that I went into an MCC church. But sitting in that sanctuary last weekend with folks, watching people express their gender in different ways, it felt comfortable and it felt right. It also gave me new ideas about how we could collect tithes here at church. So, Mark, if you want to think about that for next time. It wasn't until a friend texted me last weekend, so I'm sitting there for the gospel show, and a friend texted me to invite me to go to a party. And I said that I was at a conference for the weekend, and we were kicking it off with a drag gospel show, and she responded with, "I don't know how to process anything you just said." And then I realized that, maybe what we're doing is a little bit unusual. I forget, because I'm just so in MCC that I forget things like that are maybe not so commonplace for others. MCC is somewhat unusual at times. We do, and we have always done, things that may give others pause. At one point during the evening, one of the folks finished a song and marveled at the experience. And she said she couldn't believe that we were letting them do this. Do it in a church. And MCC moderator, Reverend Elder Rochelle Brown, and I turned to each other and said, they clearly don't know what church this is. What this church is a church that celebrates and affirms all people. It is a church that started with radical action, the proclamation that LGBTQ folks are God's beloved. Though truth be told, in the early days, this denomination, the message was mostly that gays and lesbians were God's beloved, and it took some time before the inclusion of trans and gender nonconforming and queer and other sexual minorities were fully brought into the fold. But we're working on it. We continue to work on it. This is a church that is trying. This is a church that continues to work in the direction of affirming and celebrating all people and celebrating our sexuality. This is a church that was built on a radical message and on bold action. This is a church that emerged at the intersection of sexuality, spirituality, and justice. This is a church that formed not just as a church, but as a movement. At the network gathering last weekend, Reverend Elder Brown gave a talk and hosted a dialogue about the denomination. She talked about where we've been, where we are, where we might be going. And during the conversation, Elder Brown talked about a question that often circulates in MCC. Is MCC a church, or is it a movement? Fortunately, there isn't really a wrong answer here because it's both. But MCC is both a church and it is a movement. MCC is older than I am, and I did not find MCC until I was a young adult, so I am relatively new. And by that count, I'm also relatively new to tolerating the whole church thing in general. And what I know is that I owe thanks to all of those who have come before me for the fact that I am able to stand here today. And what I know of the early years of MCC comes from the stories that I've heard and that I've read. And when I hear and read those stories, my instant reaction is always, yes, I love this. Knowing that this started at the intersection of sexuality, spirituality, and justice, three of my favorite things, throw in community, and it's all of my favorite things, which we do from its founding to its future, all based on community. When I was in seminary, I was one of two students from MCC. The other student commuted from Connecticut, and she left after my first year, so then I was alone. And I didn't feel like I had that community that I once knew before I went to seminary, when I left my home church to go to school. And at my school, there were three major denominations to which most of the student body belonged, and they had worship together, and they had fellowship together, and they went to church together. They took classes required by their denomination together. And so it was hard to not want to be part of that. Folks from the United Church of Christ and Unitarian Universalist tried to convert me all the time. And I think my theology maybe led a lot of people to believe that I already was a Unitarian Universalist. It felt that it would be easy to kind of slide over and join one of these communities that seemed so fully formed and alive on campus. But then I would have moments of connection with other folks from MCC, or I'd learn more about the denomination and what it's done, and I would get really fired up and question myself why I ever thought of moving to a different denomination. What was I possibly thinking? Because this is great. Because no other denomination was so radical in their expression, affirmation, and celebration of LGBTQ folks. No other denomination so bold in their actions and so bold in the movement they are building. Because when I looked at the history and learned the stories, I understood that we're not just a church, we're also a movement. I saw that doing justice, loving kindness, and living humbly with God were not just things that folks talked about, but that they were doing, the things that they were living. What they pushed forth and all that they did, living fully into the scripture that we read this evening. And so I could see the movement. I could see the flow of energy, the flow of the Spirit propelling folks not just to share in God's love, but to live it boldly and encourage everyone to come with us. Folks in MCC were fired up. The fire I feel when I learn about the bold action and the fight for justice that we continue. Looking at the history, I could see this bold movement and how it seems now that sometimes maybe that fire has quieted just a bit as we've gotten comfortable with some of the gains that we've made. And there are still sparks of it, and there are still flames that is exciting. And there have been wonderful gains, but certainly not all that is required for the full inclusion of affirmation of all LGBTQ folks. As members of our communities are made more visible and we build more community within and outside the church, we see the progress, but maybe not fully to where we want to be. So what I know of MCC, though, is that we are able to make changes. Our second text is from MCC's Ecumenical Council that states that we have been up to something unique. And it says that we do welcome, affirm, and celebrate the goodness and the worth of LGBTI, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex people and the queer community. And yet we are still more. We are compelled to work for justice for all creation, including environmental protection, peace, and the end to poverty, racism, oppression for LGBTQ people, etc. Etc. implies so much more, and also the work at the intersections. And yes, MCC has fought against the oppression of LGBTQ folks, and the great advances have been made, and there is still more work to be done, and there is still more to fight for. But central to all of this work is doing justice and loving kindness and living humbly with God. Central and necessary to all of this work is love, which sometimes feels hard and sometimes feels lost. At times, we are confronted suddenly and harshly with things that leave us at a loss, leave us wondering how we might possibly do justice, love kindness, and live humbly with God, questioning how that might ever be enough. Last weekend in Las Vegas, a person opened fire at a large concert, killing over 50 people and wounding hundreds more. This act of terror and mass violence is almost impossible to comprehend. As victims, families, and friends struggle to mourn in the aftermath, many of us are wondering what can be done. This is not the first time there has been a mass shooting like this that seems larger. I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer to how we can stop all of these events. I don't know how to fully stop them, but I do know that there are actions we can take to help reduce and perhaps one day eliminate tragedies such as this. Reducing and ending this violence requires that we do justice, and that we love kindness, and we live humbly with our God. God who may seem especially distant at times like these, when such violence is carried out. God does not cause this suffering, but God is with us when we do suffer, and it is God who commands that we do justice and love kindness. Horrible violence exists in this world, but living into this call, we can be the forces of love that counteract this violence. The love and kindness that we must show is not simply the please and the thank you of our everyday. It's not the simple kindness that comes your way, when you don't even have to think about it. We have to be more bold. We have to take action in our kindness, not just allow it to find us. It is kind to hold the door for someone who is coming out of the store behind you. That is kind of an expected kindness, one that often gets overlooked as even being kind, expected. A bolder act of kindness would be to cross the parking lot to help someone carry a bag with which they're struggling. It's wonderful to politely talk to family members at a holiday meal. It's a bolder act of love and kindness to go to the home of one of your family members who's maybe a little difficult to talk to and doesn't leave the home very often. Going out of your way to show kindness also helps stimulate the love that we seek to spread. These acts of kindness might not put an end to mass murder, but it may help to move us in that direction. In the United States, we need a huge culture shift. Access to guns is not the whole of the problem. It plays a large role and is so much more. In the wake of these tragedies, we turn our conversations to talking about gun control and gun reform. And I agree that we need to take a very careful look at the gun industry and all that it entails. In this case, there might be an opportunity to live boldly, to work for justice, to help increase safety. This is an act of justice that can look like advocacy, both private and public. But the guns that are used to carry out these heinous actions are not the root of the cause of the problem, of the actions. And perhaps these acts of kindness that we can live boldly into, perhaps they will not put an end to those mass tragedies, but it may be possible for us to do our part in starting to shift our culture toward love and community, and away from hate and isolation, the things that help to contribute to the factors that result in committing these acts of violence. But to do this requires action. It requires movement. It requires building a movement. It requires continuing a movement. It means stoking the fire that is already burning within, the fire that has always burned within MCC. In MCC, we have seen this fire rage, this fire to do justice, to love kindness, and to live humbly with God. And once that looked like affirming our sexuality, affirming that sex is good, affirming that our genders, our sexes, our loves are good, and that we are worthy of the respect of others, that others are shown without question. The fire of this movement has carried us far, but there's still a long way to go, and not just in the fight and the protection, affirmation, and celebration of LGBTQ folks, but in the way that we love and do justice with and for all God's people. The way that God calls us to it, as our denomination calls us for it. And at the heart of MCC is the radical spirit that leads to bold action. The bold acts of kindness that will help to lead us in the way of love, so that together we can again feel the flow of energy, the flow of the Spirit propelling folks not just to share in God's love, but to live boldly and encourage everyone to come with us.